Hi, Julie. How are you? Welcome to Sentientist Conversations.
Thank you, Jamie. Lovely to be speaking with you.
So just as to welcome you to Sentientist Conversations, the idea of this series is to delve into the two deepest philosophical questions. What's real? What should we believe in? And what matters morally? And what should we care about? What should we have compassion for? And as you know from our conversations, the idea behind this very simple worldview, sentientism, is that we should use a naturalistic approach based on using evidence and reason when it comes to thinking about what to believe, so that we should engage honestly with reality to try and understand it, however imperfect that understanding might be. And then when it comes to what matters morally, the clue is in the name. We should care and have compassion for all sentient beings, any being that has the capacity to experience suffering or flourish. So that's the idea. But in these conversations, I'm talking to people who agree with that philosophy deeply, but also to people who disagree with it. So it will be fascinating to understand your own personal philosophical journey, if you like. But before we get started, for people who don't know you and your advocacy and your artistry and your writing, how would you best introduce yourself?
Jamie, I would say that for the first couple of decades of my life, I was, even though I liked animals and I loved my pets, but all my focus really was on humans, both in my interests as a child and as an adolescent. As a child, I was really interested in the pursuit of knowledge, and as an only child, I would spend hours reading Arthur Mee's 10 volumes of the children's encyclopedia, not the whole lot, of course. I'd pick and choose. But that gave me a very good grounding by the time I was about 12 years of age of all the horrible, horrible things that humans had done to each other through the centuries. But it wasn't till my early 30s that I also found out that similar things humans were doing to animals, exploitation. Really, that was my beginning.
And how would you describe, I guess, the focus of your life and the things you've done in that context?
Do you mean the early part of my life, or?
Well, both really. If someone asked you to describe in a sentence who you are and what you do, how would you summarize that if it's possible? Whether that's advocacy, whether it's your writing, whether it's your other time in the arts.
Yes, I would say it's been a combination of work, which for many years was in public service type of work, social work or this sort of thing. But my interests have always been writing and art, painting, creative pursuits.
Yeah, thank you. So the first question that I like to focus on in these conversations is that simple but at the same time complex question of what's real. And for many people, their philosophy or their story is about whether they grew up in a religious or a spiritual household or a more naturalistic or an atheistic household, and how their perspective has shifted over time, if it has, about that side of philosophy and what's real, the natural and the supernatural. And you've talked already about having a thirst for knowledge and reading the children's encyclopedia, but how would you describe that journey from childhood to the present day and your current philosophy?
I think really I was more interested in spiritual things rather than religious. I did courses in Judaism, in Christianity. I studied Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. But my philosophy, I think, has always been that there's an interconnectedness with everything in life, with all the different races and cultures, and that diversity is a part of life. We only have to look at all the varieties of fish or birds or different kinds of humans, different races, that everywhere we look, with flowers, with trees, it's diversity. And so that I feel that it was more looking at things that way. I think I was always rather opposed to any fundamentalist view that it's got to be Christianity or it's got to be Judaism, or it's more a broader vision.
Thank you. And I think many people find that path in that they reject the more sort of fundamental or strict tenets of any particular religion, but still have that sense of interconnectedness and oneness and the sense that we're part of something much larger than ourselves. But in a way, there's still a choice there that people take too. So I feel those things quite strongly, but I do that in a very naturalistic way. So I think of, physics and biology and maths and a sort of scientific worldview, which does demonstrate the connectedness of all things and the fact there are common elements that everything is based on and that we're all interdependent. So in a way, I feel that sort of rich sense of awe and wonder and connectedness still in a very naturalistic worldview, while others will feel those same things, but it will lead them to feel that there is something magical or separate or supernatural or distinct about those feelings as well. Do you have a sense of whether you followed more of a naturalistic path to that sense of connectedness, richness and diversity, or is there a sense of the mystical there for you as well?
There's both, Jamie. I mean, even from as a very small child, I always felt a very deep connection with naturalistic view. And I remember walking to school as a young child, and I just felt that everything, the flowers, the trees, the plants, everything seemed to have this spiritual vibration. I've always felt that there's a spirit in everything, that nature and humans and animals, wildlife, that everything has this very strong spiritual component, so that nature, in fact, does have spirit. Spirit's very important.
Thank you. And even there, I think there's some commonality, because while I think you might see there being some form of spirit or some sort of connection between all different aspects of nature, I would describe that in terms of a common underlying physics, or the fact that we're all doing information processing, or the fact that we're all communicating and interacting in certain ways, that we can't, ever perfectly separate ourselves off from the world. So I think even in those different ways of looking at the world, there's still some commonality. And another thing I think that both of those ways of looking at the world have in common is a comfort with not knowing everything and recognizing that there is much that we don't understand. And I think that's true of a more spiritual way of thinking. There's a sense of mystery in the unknown, and maybe an acknowledgement that maybe we'll never be able to perfectly understand some of those aspects. But to my mind, those perspectives are present in a naturalistic worldview as well as a more scientific worldview, in that the heart of that has to be humble. It has to be recognizing that we don't know everything. We may not know everything ever. There may be some things it's impossible for us to know. So we should always be humble and open-minded and looking for more answers and looking for more stories. So I think there's much in common even between those two different worldviews. But one important difference, and I think this will come on to our second question about morality and what's important. One important thing, I think, for people, whether they've taken a broader, more spiritual worldview or have some other sort of sense of transcendence, is guarding against the risk that we then build in problematic human ways of thinking into that understanding of the world. So where some people, I think, will have a very broad sort of sense of connectedness and appreciation for the universe that we live in, others will say there is some sort of magical spiritual thing that connects us all. They will maybe then impute a personality to that, which in many religions takes the form of a god, often framed in a male image, that then has opinions and makes judgments and can reward and can punish, and often has lists of rules written down by people in old books that then drive some quite strange ethical decisions, many of which you were horrified by when you looked through your encyclopedia and history. So how do you think we guard against the people wanting to take a very broad, open-minded, but still spiritual worldview that recognizes the connectedness of all things, but guard against people then taking that and using it for their own ends and maybe undermining or warping compassionate ethics in damaging ways through use of the supernatural.
Yes, I think you've struck on a very important point. I've always had more questions than answers.
Yeah.
And I think when you talk about science and physics, even Einstein said that he wanted to do that to try and understand how God created the universe. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because with astrophysicists or physicists, cosmologists, some of them believe in God and others don't. My own view is that I have always been very faith-based, even from a very small child. And I've always started every day in prayer and meditation to God, but my understanding of God is not a Christian God or a Jewish God, or it's something much broader. It's probably a sort of an energy that's in the universe or something like that, something that really, I guess I feel as if we are like ants in a huge machine. We don't have the sensory equipment to understand it all. And therefore, that's why I find people who think they have all the answers, I find that very difficult to accept. So it's interesting, even, for example, with Christians, their interpretation of the Bible, we have two different groups. There are those who say we have to stick to all the words that are in the New Testament. That's the word of God. But then there are other Christians, and some of them are elders in churches and very senior positions, and they say, no, we shouldn't take the literal interpretation. We should rather have a more symbolic interpretation. So my own worldview is that if we are too, what shall I say, too narrow in our thinking, I think it can lead to a lot of harm. I just feel to be open-minded, to be a free thinker. Yeah. Both my parents were free thinkers, and both my parents were interested in all cultures, all religions, and I think I've got that from them too.
Yeah, and I think that maybe is a really important distinction, because I don't use the word God to refer to anything really, because I think it has much of an association with being a personality, an individual, a judge, something that's been defined within the formal religion. So I just don't really use the word to describe anything that I think is real. But I think the way you use the term, and actually I think when Einstein and some other scientists use the term God, they mean it in a similar sense. They mean a sense of the unknown or the universe, or maybe an energy that connects everything. And I think if you think of God in that sense, in that broad sense, it doesn't imply, there's very little risk there that drives a specific dangerous ethic, right? There's no reason why believing that everything is connected and there is an energy and there's a sense of the unknown and a sense of the universe and describing that as God, there is no reason why thinking that would lead you to sexism or homophobia or caste discrimination or apostasy or cruel punishments for blasphemy or many of the other things that we see that come out of a more formal established religion. So I think that's the distinction. There's a very broad, open-minded perception of, you can call it God, as distinct from seeing God as an ethically perfect being that is all-powerful, sometimes not, and all-knowing. And that's a very distinct form of God that really is made, I think, in a human image, normally a human male image. So maybe that's the difference. It's the perception of a sort of ephemeral God as being the universe and a connecting energy versus seeing a God as being really an all-powerful person with the capacity to judge. And I think maybe that's the difference, because I don't think the former, your way of thinking, can warp your ethics, but often thinking of God as a sort of super powerful person, unfortunately, does seem to warp people's ethics. Does that make sense?
I completely agree with you, Jamie. Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. And I think that's an important distinction in the way you described your sense of God and spirituality has helped me work that through as we've been talking. And that brings us on nicely to the second conversation. The second question, the big question, is what matters? For some people, one of the reasons why they're hesitant about moving away from a religious way of thinking is because formal religious ways of thinking, I think they're very poorly founded and often drive very warped ethics, but they do at least lay out an ethical system. So they will say, here are the commandments, or here's the Quran or the Torah, or a list of rules that you need to follow. There is a perfect judge, this person of a God that will decide what is good and bad and will punish you or reward you in this life or the after. So it's an ethical system. I think generally it's a very bad one, but it does exist. And some people are worried that if you move away from a religious worldview, you'll lose any moral foundations. Why would anything matter if there isn't a God judging you? And I've never felt that as a particular challenge, but it'd be interesting to know, in your worldview and your way of thinking, what would you say is the foundation of morality? What does matter to you? Why does it matter? And it would also be good to know, as your story is developed, how you're thinking about which types of entities matter has shifted. And you've hinted at that already, because you started thinking about human concerns and human suffering, and then broadened your moral scope to think about non-humans as well. So it would be great to understand that foundation and then that journey for expanding your moral scope.
Yes, it's been a very interesting journey for me, Jamie, and quite unexpected, I have to say. If someone would have told me 20 or perhaps 30 years ago that I would now be feeling so passionate about animal activism, I would have been very surprised.
Yeah.
Because I was so involved with human activities and creative pursuits, but it was a number of events that I experienced that changed that. But the question about what matters to me, a number of people have influenced me. For example, I like the idea of Albert Schweitzer's reverence for life. So I don't share his passion for Christianity. He was a very interesting man. Of course, many people know him as the doctor who went over and founded a leprosy colony in Africa. Yeah. But prior to doing that, he had a doctorate of philosophy. He was a lecturer in philosophy. This idea of reverence for life, that really resonated with me. And I think the thing that really struck me in terms of what really matters is I hate injustice. And I just feel the exploitation and abuse to animals, and I include my own family, my own ancestors in that, who made a lot of their income from animals and animal products. So in a way, I almost feel I want to atone for that. And also for my younger years, when I wore leather and fur and ate animal goods, totally unaware of the dreadful suffering, the absolute horrific abuse to animals. So what matters to me today is different to what mattered to me years ago. There's been a number of other people that have influenced me. For example, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher. really, his analytical approach, analytical philosophy, and the idea that we shouldn't allow injustice to continue due to impediments that are wrong. And Krishnamurti, his idea of education, and having been a teacher and being a tutor and an educator, the idea that this is something that really matters to me a lot, that an education should include all aspects of living, not just to get work or something like this. So those are the things that matter to me, I would say, I've been influenced. And of course, there's been a number of incidents that I witnessed that have helped to really ground my thinking. So I don't know if you want me to talk about those or perhaps later.
Yeah, that would be interesting to hear, because quite often for some people it's a gradual process of realization or breaking down cognitive dissonance or working things through for themselves. And for other people, it's a question of really trigger events or things that force a different way of thinking. So it would be interesting to know, what those events were and how they changed the way you think.
Yes, well, the first incidents really that made me rethink the way I saw animals was that a stray homeless dog followed me home through a park. And I phoned the council because I thought maybe that dog's lost. And the council officer came out, Leon Stewart Harris, his name was. He was the most remarkable man. And I really regard him as my mentor. I only met him 3 times, but a very interesting story, because he ended up losing his job with the council, being sacked, because what he did, instead of bringing stray dogs to the pound, and in those days they would have only held the dog for 4 or 5 days and then killed the dog, he found homes. He talked us into keeping that dog. But it was the way he spoke to that dog. That dog was so nervous and tense when he came in, this little stray homeless dog. And he said, "Hello, little person." And he kept calling it a little person. And that was the first time I really thought about animals in the same way that I did about humans. And after he was sacked for not bringing in the quotas and also not getting enough parking tickets, he stood for council, and a whole lot of us tried to back him up. He died, unfortunately, later in a plane crash. But that was the start of my journey. And then the second thing was when I started to go to an egg farm to get lovely fresh eggs in inverted commas, and, hundreds and hundreds of cages with all these hens, 6 or 7 hens in each cage squashed together. And when I went to the office and said, "Why are they like that?" And they said, "Oh, well, they're like that all the time. And when they stop producing eggs, they're slaughtered." So then when I phoned the RSPCA and they told me that it's illegal, that was, again, another stepping stone.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because while the RSPCA and those organisations do lots of great work, they're really only about preventing cruelty to certain animals, not really farmed animals in the essence of that industry. But I think it's interesting to lay out both of those examples, because what I think they helped you do is to, however imperfectly, take the perspective of the animal, recognize that they do have a perspective, thinking of that dog as whether it's as a little person or a dog in their own right. And the same with the chickens. It's actually appreciating that they do have a perspective, that there's something that it's like to be an animal, that they can suffer. And that concept really is at the heart of sentientism, is recognizing the sentience of other beings, human and otherwise, and that has moral salience. And to my mind, that cuts through so much philosophical argument and loads of other reasoning and loads of other thinking and loads of social norms with a very simple and naturalistically grounded fact that we're very confident that, other beings do have perspectives. They can experience suffering just as I know I can. Because I liked the way you talked about the term reverence before, because in a way, that's just another term for saying I value something, I revere it, I see it as important. And there's another dangerous path that I think many people follow that have a worldview that's similar to yours. So they will say, we're all connected, spiritually or otherwise. I have a reverence for all life. But then they will say, and of course, in that natural connectedness, there is a circle of life where maybe life consumes life. There is an evolutionary process that has always involved predation and consuming of other beings. In a way, maybe plants they can suffer in their own way as well. Animals can suffer too. Suffering is just a natural part of the world and the universe. I have a reverence for that pattern and that process. So it's okay for me to continue paying to have sentient animals tortured and killed for me to eat. Do you see how someone can follow that path and they end up in a position where they are deliberately and consciously causing needless harm, but they reassure themselves that they're doing it in a reverential way that respects the sanctity of nature and life as a whole. And in a way, I find that it's such a sad path for people to follow down because, and arguably many environmentalists have done this too, where they've gone beyond the human race genuinely, and they've started to think about the environment and the ecosphere and habitats and diversity of species and how everything is connected. But they're still trapped by those social norms that carve out and excuse, for example, what we see in animal farming and some of the other types of animal abuse that you've described. Yeah, so I guess I'm just sharing a frustration that people who see that connectedness and have that sort of almost spiritual connection with a very wide concept of what life and the universe is and have that sense of reverence can still cause awful harm. And that's certainly not a path you've followed, because I think you see the value of the perspective of the others. You see the value of and the perspective of the chicken and the bear or the dog that you've experienced.
Yes, I think what you've said, Jamie, really resonates very well. It is a very complex issue, isn't it? Because maybe I'm just also wondering whether what we experienced as children, how that affects us in our attitudes to others and animals. See, one thing with me was that I was very blessed that I had so much love as a child. Being an only child, I was very spoilt. That I had unconditional love. And I used to wonder, how could someone cope who'd never had that? Someone who's been abused as a child has never experienced true love or unconditional love, then how can they be loving to others or to animals? And it's interesting because we quite often hear, don't we, cases we might read about someone who has committed terrible crimes against others or animal cruelty, and then we find out that they were treated so badly as a child. That's the other difficulty, isn't it? It's so complex. That's the trouble. It's so complicated. But that is why, Jamie, I really do believe there has to be very strong laws. We only have to consider what happens in human society in the case of war or civil war, where law and order breaks down. What happens? Murders, rapes, pillages, all things like that. And therefore, the fact that there are practically no laws to protect animals who are regarded just as property or products, therefore, there's no protection for them. There's always going to be those who will want to do harm to others. And that's why we have laws. And therefore, as part of the solution, if we want to change things, and I know we can go into this more later, but it's essential to have laws, strong laws and regulations.
I agree. And in a way, this concept of sentientism is really about epistemology, what's real, and it's about values, what should have moral worth. So that might seem like it's quite far away from laws and regulations and declarations and treaties and so on. But I think you're right. I think it's very naive to think that we can quickly move to a future where, all 8 billion people on the planet have a naturalistic worldview and grant compassion for and moral consideration for all sentient beings. So in a way, part of the program also has to be making very formal, specific changes. It's not just about our individual decisions as a consumer. It's also about our individual decisions as a voter and as a campaigner and as a manager or a leader or a shareholder or whatever roles we can play in society. But it's also about the institutional level changes that we need to see, whether that's in law and regulations and policy and treaties. And it's been interesting to think that through. As a thought experiment, I've, for example, rewritten the Sustainable Development Goals as if they've been written with a concern for all sentient beings in mind. And I've had a go at rewriting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a universal declaration of sentient rights to say, why should this just be about humans? And I think we need more of those thought experiments, but we also need a broad program of change to put those types of values into all of our laws and regulations and policies too. And I guess that's the final part of the conversation is you can be more pessimistic or optimistic depending on how you're feeling today. But if we can move towards a more naturalistic ethic and a more compassionate, unconditional love ethic, what would that future look like for you?
I'm very optimistic, actually, because the way I see it, I feel that we are really in the initial stages of a total revolution in our relationships with animals, with non-human animals. If we consider that for thousands and thousands of years, we have used animals, and now, really only since the 1970s starting, there's movements growing and growing. And what I find fascinating, absolutely fascinating, Jamie, when I go onto Twitter, it doesn't matter how much time I spend on Twitter, I can find another 100 Twitter accounts that are vegan or that are very pro-change for animals. The beginning of a huge movement. And this really has only been able to take place because of social media. It is such a powerful tool. It's connecting us all. But I agree with what you said when you were talking about that having the laws. So it's not that simple. The way forward is through education, re-education. And that is because we have been educated, in inverted commas, for thousands of years that this is the way we treat animals. Therefore, what I feel we need is re-education. One of the things is it should be mandatory, compulsory in schools from a junior age, even from the age of 5 upwards, that children learn about the history of animal-human relations, the truth, not the big lie about happy cows and happy chickens, the truth. Just children learn about what happened in human history. Very important. The other thing is, as well as in schools, more and more films to show that we've had Hogwood, Dominion, now Gumba. We need more and more of these to show the truth, to reveal it. Then we need fiction. and non-fiction. Now, talking about fiction, I'm actually halfway through a book, a fiction piece about an animal activist. But let me give you an example of how dangerous and misleading fiction can be in educating children. There is a picture book about the first dog that went into space. I was furious when I read that book, absolutely furious, because what it does, the book at the end says, oh, there was a happy ending for mankind. This dog helped mankind. The truth was that poor dog, there was no plan for that dog to come back. That was a stray dog picked up on the streets and then had a life of absolute terror in a laboratory, being kept in smaller and smaller compartments and then sent off to die from heat. Now, obviously, you can't tell the truth to a young child, but you shouldn't lie. You shouldn't lie.
Yeah.
It shouldn't have said it's got a happy ending. And this has been just one example of this lie that has been so successful that some of my closest friends, and this is what I just can't get over, and people that I know for a long time, intelligent, educated people, they still won't believe that calves are separated from their mothers to produce the milk for humans. This lie is so entrenched, and therefore the way to change this, we need lots of material, lots of books telling the truth. And also it needs to be told to children, because we know, this is what's so interesting, most very young children really love animals. And I know I had an example of a friend of mine who said, oh, my son said he won't eat lamb because he loves the lambs. And I said to him, you need your protein. It's this retrenched attitude. So education through all these different means. And as well as that, we need, I think, more conversations like what you're doing. I think what you're doing is fantastic, because I've learned a lot just listening to some of the guests that you've had. And it's wonderful to know that so many of us felt this way, but we couldn't really talk about it to anyone. The people you've had on, I've heard them say that, oh, members of their family think they're weird, that they're vegan or things like this. So this is the beginning of a very big movement. So education and then with the law together, that's what's going to bring about. In fact, I will make a prediction. I predict that within one generation from now, so that's 20, 25 years, the whole thing will be totally different. However, there's one thing I really want to talk about. I know a lot of your guests have talked about food, farmed animals, but what I really feel needs a huge spotlight is the animal experiments and testing. This has been so secretive for years, and I must say it's relatively recently that I found out all about it, because unless you actually work in one of those labs, you can't know what goes on because it's so secretive. Now, the White Coat Project, the White Coat Waste Project in the United States, I'm a great supporter of theirs. It is absolutely astonishing what they're achieving. And one of the reasons they're able to achieve this is that their founder once worked in a lab.
Yeah.
And it's the scary thing is that there's not just thousands of animals that go into labs. There's millions around the world. And I think that this, I'm hoping if anyone's listening to me who's an activist, we need to have a lot more activism in this area. Expose it. Mm. There's no rules. There's no laws to help these animals.
And I think there's a hopeful message there that I think is reinforced by the fact that both in research and in food and in other animal-centered industries, they have to hide so much. They can't be transparent. Now, the reason they have to hide is because they can't ethically justify what they do. If it was ethically justified, you wouldn't have to hide it. And the reason it has to be hidden is actually, I think, a positive thing. It's because most humans don't want to needlessly cause harm or suffering or death. I'm not saying default human ethics are great. We have many different problems, tribalism and self-interest and many other things. But generally, most people on this planet do not want to needlessly cause suffering and death. So if you want to do that, if you can't justify ethically what you're doing, you have to hide it. So in a way, that's why these industries and these research methods are hidden away, because the people who are driving them habitually can't justify what they're doing. So I think you're right. I think that there's a powerful thing we can do through education and transparency and just bringing these things to light, because as you do that, you help people tap into, I think, the way their ethics already are. You don't really need to persuade people that needlessly causing animal suffering and cruelty is a bad thing. They know that already. But if we can just make these things more transparent, more clear, and bring them to the forefront, and also make it socially and practically easier for people to switch and to change, I think you might be right. I think, we're at the start of what could be a very seismic shift. And I would love to have you on in another 20 years as another generation has passed, and we can check if your prediction has come true. But I share that hopefulness, really. I think that with societally and practically making things easier, with more transparency, we can tap into what is, I think, in a latent sense, a basically decent human ethic that most people have already. And maybe that's a positive note to end on. It's been a fascinating conversation, and it's been a privilege to hear your philosophical journey and the things you think are important. But before we wrap up, what's the best way of people following you and keeping up to date with your work and hearing your opinions and getting involved in your campaigns?
I think Twitter's probably the best.
Great. I will include a link to your Twitter account in the show notes for the YouTube and the podcast, so people can click and give you a follow and come and chat to you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. It's been great speaking with you, and I really appreciate what you're doing. I think it's just fabulous. And one last point I'll just make in that last point that you made. I agree that most people, for example, don't like cruelty, but it's the indifference that we have to fight. There's too many people that are indifferent to suffering.
Yeah, and I think that, as you said, just making the reality transparent, showing them the reality will help break through that. Great. Let's hope. Let's get back to work on it. Well, Judy, thank you very much for making the time to join this Sentientist conversation. It's been brilliant to have a proper conversation with you. It's nice to have Twitter DMs here and there, but it's great to have a proper conversation. So thank you very much for taking the time.
And thank you very much, Jamie.